Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining in, as always, for these webinars. In our trust to kind of bring you a few things which are away from the investment world, today's webinar is along the same lines. It's titled, the coming wars and India. And just to give you a brief about what we are going to address today, is that conventional wars, as you all know, have been fought on battlefields with guns, bombs, ammunitions, etc. And we have entered a new era where there are different kinds of wars that are taking place, but with an impact which is as severe to humanity and the globe. And these are wars in the form of narrative wars, media wars, biological warfare, trade wars, water wars, and you name it, technology wars included. And to talk more about it and just to give us a sense of how India is placed to tackle so many challenges, we have with us Karan Datta. And I'd like to give a brief on Karan before I hand it over to him. I've known Karan now for quite a lot of time, but more from an investment world's perspective. Karan has over 25 years of experience in the financial service industry, and he has held leadership positions across various esteemed organizations like Goldman Sachs, Franklin Templeton, Axis Mutual, Aditya Birla Financial Services, and Tata Finance, with key roles in business, sales, marketing operations, and distribution. Most recently, he served as the Chief Business Officer at Axis Mutual Fund, prior to which he was at Goldman Sachs Asset Management as the National Sales Head, and at Franklin Templeton in a sales leadership role, both in Singapore as well as in India. He's an accomplished speaker and is regularly invited to speak on topics such as national security, costs of terrorism in India, sports, and business. Karan also currently sits on the boards of Edelweiss Asset Management, Prudent Corporate Advisory, and Tamohara Investments as an independent director. So a very, very warm welcome to you, Karan. I know that the last time you had prepared an excellent presentation on India, China, and Pakistan. And that was very, very well received by the entire community. And I look forward to this session. So without any further delay, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for this super nice, warm welcome. And you won't believe this, Nitin, but it is so nice for me to come back on the Motilal platform, because this one platform actually took our talk literally viral, and so many people saw it across the globe. And I got calls from friends, family, relatives, people I didn't know. And so there's a special fondness for the Motilal Oswal Private Wealth platform, because that's where it all started from. And when I spoke to you the other day that I put together some slides on series 2, you were kind enough to give me an opportunity. So thanks a lot. And, just very quickly for your audiences, what Nitin has spoken about, just as a precursor to the talk, is that we're in very strange yet different times, because the world is at a space where we've not had a serious war in the last 70 years, but it seems as if the entire world is at loggerheads with each other. So, since World War II, which is almost now 75 years behind, and like we've already spent 75 years since the world was at war. And yet we went through phases of the Cold War, we went through phases of terrorism. Now we're coming to a phase of a new form of war, which is biological war. The point I'm just trying to make is, even though the conventional format has not happened at a very large scale, yet the world is at some form of loggerheads with each other. And I think it's very important to understand what that means for our nation. So in a way, I've turned the lens around this time, and I will speak about these new forms of warfare, but the lens is this time purely from an India point of view. And what is India doing to prepare herself, prepare us as citizens, as a nation, and probably as an economic entity, as to how do we tackle this over the next 40, 50 years. So I'm going to just delve into that. If you give me a minute, I'll just start my slides. Just one sec. And Nitin, just a quick confirmation, if you can see my slides.
It should be coming up.
Can you see that now?
Not yet. Not yet. Vinay, can you help, please?
No worries. Just one sec.
I have given Karan the rights to share his screen.
Can you
Yeah.
see?
Yeah,
Yes.
now it's coming.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. Yeah, so that's pretty much the title I wanted to speak about, the coming wars and India. And like I said, we'll spend a little bit of time I'll spend a little bit of time on what these formats of war are. But a majority of the time that I would spend is tackling it from an India lens. What are we doing about it? And are we ready for it? So let's just start straight with the slides. These are the new formats of war. And there are 9 of them that I could think of. These are 9 that I spent a lot of time studying, reading, and actually I've been analyzing some of them. Some of them we are right in the middle of them. So let's just look at these 9. Just very quickly. I won't spend a lot of time on detailing out all the 9. I will pick up 3 to just share with you what those 3 and 4 look like, and then probably share my experiences on how they're kind of panning out. But so it can't spend so much time on all 9, but 3 or 4 we'll pick up. Cyber is something that we're all aware of. Most countries have come under cyber attacks. The Australians have come under cyber attacks. The Indians have come under cyber attacks. Even the Americans have come under cyber attacks. And India has also kind of done reverse cyber attacks on Pakistan and China. So they're the world's kind of dealing with cyber. Number 2 is the electromagnetic pulse, which is the EMP. Not very many people talk about electromagnetic pulse, but in my previous talk, I had spoken about how an EMP attack actually crippled a couple of very, very seriously large destroyers of that the American and the British navies have. And this is a completely new form of warfare. It is a high burst of energy, and it kind of shuts down every form of electrical equipment on either an aircraft or on a warship. Perhaps, and I'm just leaving this as a thought, there is no conclusion on this, but the chopper crash in which the Taiwanese air chief, the defense chief of Taiwan died a year ago, and we very recently had the chief of defense staff, Bipin Rawat, dying in a helicopter crash. I don't want to sound kind of sensationalist on this, but perhaps there is a link to an electromagnetic pulse kind of format war out here. And maybe in the Q&A section, we can talk more about it, but I'm just leaving some ideas on where these new forms are headed. Third form of war is water. It's actually water wars that are at the center of many, many new ways in which the world is dealing with its future. I'd spoken about this again the last time, that water is the center of all troubles between China and India right now. The Tibet region is home to 270 odd glaciers. It is the most glacial land in the world. And China has built close to, it has about 30,000 dams. China has about 30,000 dams. That's 50% of the dams in the world belong to China right now. So there is something serious and sinister going around as far as water is concerned. So we tend to look at Siachen, we tend to look at Ladakh, we tend to look at Galwan and many parts as land issues, but they're actually not land issues. This entire sequence is for water. The next one is economics, and this is not about, it's more about economics and less about politics. The economic wars and trade wars are kind of linked. I'll give you an example of what's happening on economic and trade wars. Look at what's happening with the Australians and the Chinese. The Chinese have implemented something like 150% duty on 7 or 8 very, very important articles that were exported by the Australians to the Chinese, which basically means there's been billions of dollars of losses for the Australian economy simply because they asked this fundamental question. This basic one question was asked by the Australians: can we try and seek the origins of the Wuhan virus? And the retort was that the Chinese ended up with duties on 7 items, which is costing the Australian economy billions and billions of dollars. So from iron, coal to wine to meat, every one of those items have got anything between 150 to 180% duties. So that's the new form of trade wars. Sixth, biological war. And this is something I'll talk in detail in the subsequent slides, because we're right in the middle of biological warfare for the last 2 years. And again, this is after studying this for a bit of time and effort that has gone into just kind of getting my head around it. But I'll show you some stats in the next slides, and then it'll probably get clearer as to why do I term it as a warfare of biological natures. The seventh and eighth are also linked: narrative and psychological ops. Both of them are linked in the sense that this is a form of war in which the way you and I think is being controlled. And this is another aspect I'm going to spend a little bit more time, because people don't realize how we react to news that is coming to us. And it's very important to, and I'll give you some examples as to what I mean by it. So narrative, psyops, and media wars is something that we become consumers of what is being thrown to us, and then we build our opinions. So opinion building and kind of then reacting to that opinion is literally being controlled. And there, again, you won't believe this, but something like this is an annual spend of anything between 20 to $25 billion on how you and I think. That's how big this piece is. And the last, and perhaps amongst the bigger ones, the next generation warfare is about semiconductors, nanochips. And again, if you remember in my last talk, I had spoken about semiconductors, and we can see that how the semiconductor issue is playing out across the world in terms of shortages, etc. But the real future of this new warfare is actually not semiconductors. It is about controlling nanochips. Which country controls nanochips, which are 5nm, which are the toughest technology to build out? Will the Chinese win that war, or the Americans win that war? Because that one will decide who wins algo wars. So I'm just kind of redoing this whole 8 or 9 forms. It's cyber, electro, economics, trade, biological, media, semiconductors. But what you'll notice in all of this conversation, there is not a single bullet fired, not a single missile. And like Nitin had introduced this entire topic, this is not conventional. So it's very asymmetric. It is not an army fighting an army. It is not air forces taking on air forces. It is actually a multitude of aspects taking on a multitude of other aspects. So it's very important that as citizens of India, we recognize that we are in the middle of all of these, or at least some of these. And it's very important to figure out how are we tackling it. So I'm going to take the example of 2 or 3 of them. For example, biological warfare and narrative wars. Those are 2 I want to spend a little bit of time. Let's just look at bioweapons attack. I want to take you back. We're obviously in the middle of another wave. That's the 3rd wave, but I don't want to spend too much time on the 3rd wave, because that's something that is still emerging. But I want to take you back to April of 2021, which is when Delta hit us. And prior to that Delta hitting us, India had controlled wave 1 quite well, even though it resulted in a pretty strict lockdown. So we just emerged out of the strictest lockdown possible, and we kind of evaded the bullet, which is the bullet in this form was the bioweapons bullet. But as soon as Delta came in, look at how things changed for us. In less than 30 days, India went from 10,000 cases, and I'm just quoting numbers because the statistics are easily available and you can go back and check. In 30 days, India went from 10,000 cases to 4 lakh a day. And again, we had to impose lockdowns. Again, GDP got hit. 10 times increase in medical oxygen was required. I mean, I'm sure all of you remember those days. It's not as if it's 10 years ago. And from 900 metric ton of oxygen, India started needing 9,000 metric tons of oxygen in less than 30 days. And there was this image of India dying, Indians breathless, India gasping for breath. And then there were these pyres being lit, and all these fancy magazines had these photos splashed all over the world of how India is a failing state. And again, I just want to kind of re-emphasize the word that it all happened in less than 30 days, but surprisingly, nothing happened in the vicinity. Nothing happened at the same time in surrounding countries. Nothing happened in China. Nothing happened even in Europe, even in the United States. The biggest brunt was borne by this nation. And I'll just take you to the next slide and look at the sequence with which it happened. In March, Bombay got hit. In April, Delhi got hit. And in May, Bangalore got hit. So first the financial capital, then the national capital, and then the IT capital. And what is very interesting is that in less than 45 days, India went from being a vaccine exporter to actually being a vaccine importer. And again, like I said, you can go back, think, and rewind and remember. There came a time when India was hailed as the vaccine exporter to the world because we started exporting to 70 countries. It's not a small number. 70 countries we started exporting to. So suddenly when you needed all that vaccine for internal usage, where went from 10,000 cases to 4 lakh, where would those 70 countries go to for vaccines? And the answer is that they had to then drop all their friction points and go back to China asking for vaccine. So it's the same Philippines, the same Indonesians, it's the same set of Asian countries which are at loggerheads, Vietnam, where we started supplying vaccines, but because India had to have those vaccines for its own citizens, they didn't have a choice, but they had to go back to China and ask for vaccine. Now, here is a situation, I'm just simplifying this. You are at loggerheads with a nation. Let's say a maritime issue has happened and Vietnam says that you cannot come fishing into my part of the sea, and the Chinese have sent vessels in. You can take them on that merit. But what if your citizens need a medicine which only the Chinese could provide at that time? That's exactly what happened. 70 countries then started approaching China for supplies, where we had started substituting it. So I think it's now very clear. If you look back now at 2 years, the fact that there is, and we can talk about this at length, and the fact that there is a center at Wuhan, there is, whether it's a lab leak or it is designed, it doesn't matter. Even if it's a lab leak or it is designed, fact of the matter is that this is now at the center of the world starting to see the effects of a bioweapons attack. And I'm not even talking about what's happening with Omicron right now, and Europe and the United States. This new wave, the biggest hit is actually United States. It's 10 lakh cases a day. Of course, it's not devastating, it's not taking lives, but it's shutting down many parts of their economy. It's kind of not allowing people to come and work. And the Chinese have 30 cases. You got to start questioning how does that work. So this is the one form that I wanted to spend time on. The other piece that I want to just share with all of you is what's happening with narrative wars. There's psychologically, there are psyops, media, narrative, consumption wars. I want to give you some idea of what I'm trying to convey out here. There are these 4 names now that come together. There's Afghanistan, there's Taliban, there's Pakistan, and China. Under any normal circumstances, you don't want to be bracketed in that list. I mean, just think of it, like there's Afghanistan, Taliban, Pakistan, India. Would you want your name to be in this list? It is almost a list of people who are probably a fairly destructive bunch of people. You really don't want your country in this list. But why is China in that bunch? Afghanistan, Taliban, Pakistan, China, and yet starting to sound as if they are the heroes. If you don't believe me, let me show you some stuff. This is literally the headlines that has hit us after Afghanistan was vacated by the United States. Look at the narrative. Joe Biden withdrawal leaves Afghanistan in crisis. US leaves chaos, destruction in Afghanistan. Afghanistan withdrawal raises questions about US reliability. But here is the funny thing. Here is the strange part. There's Afghanistan, the Talibanis, the Pakistanis, and China. So what should really we be saying? Why is China associated with these names? No, that's not what we're asking. What we're really asking is the US leaves Afghanistan in chaos, as if it is their duty to be there forever. Afghanistan raises US reliability in the region. Look at The Economist. America's failed war. US has betrayed Afghan forces. Can you now see the pattern that was emerging in that time, which is again barely 3 months ago? The only thing that we were being told is that the Americans have failed and have betrayed and have left. And what is the flip side of what we were being told? China endorses Taliban's government, announces 31 million aid. World needs to guard Taliban in Afghanistan. China tells the US. China is already sending aid to Taliban controlled Afghanistan, filling the gap US has left. It's bizarre. And we fall for it. And this is, let me explain this in no uncertain terms. It is a form of warfare. Because whoever wins this narrative war actually has the biggest advantage, because this basically sets you up to become a thought leader of sorts, supposedly a thought leader, as to then you become the guiding light for the world. And what we just assume as, oh, fine, this makes sense. Actually, you have to consume it with great care, because there's so much happening which is beyond the obvious. And this one, if you just look at what I've written out here, that the country that fought terrorism for 20 years, which is United States, has not faced a single attack on its soil since then. They are being called a destroyer, power in decline, military losses, etc. And China was being hailed in global media for providing aid to Taliban. It's actually about a $15 to $18 billion media campaign that aids China's narratives. That's the kind of money that goes annually into shaping the thought process of a certain nation. And I can go on and on and on about so many such examples. And the biggest such example is, oh, Chinese are the very best at what they do. They have great technology. They can get things done. They can build roads, railways, etc., etc. I don't want to get into all that, but this one was the closest example because it just happened. And it's something that they are being hailed for. And let me tell you, it's serious money spent on how you and I think. So given that background and this kind of format of different stories of warfare, what does it mean for India? Finally, it has to, I mean, we are citizens of this nation. We've got to live and we're going to be out here. We're not leaving this country. What does it mean for India and her security? Remember, we barely got our independence. We're like 75 years into it. So there has to be some seriousness with which we take this. Are we at all looking at it as a format in which we have to take care of ourselves? So those are things I wanted to share with all of you. And I must make the point out here that this is not a statement or a talk on the current government, but this is a statement and a talk on the policies and decision making for the future of India. So sometimes if it comes across as if I am siding or not siding a certain political party, let's just try and stay away from the politics of all of this, because the intent is to talk about policy, more policy, less politics. And I think I came to the conclusion that there are some massive tectonic shifts happening in the policy thinking of, in the way India is taking its policy decisions. There are 3 massive shifts taking place. And I wanted to share those 3 with you today. And it's completely backed with a lot of examples. So to counter the new formats of war, there are these 3 ways in which the policy makers in this country are starting to tackle it. The number one shift I see happening is that we were always a country of being non-aligned. So from independence, Nehru had decided that India would be a non-aligned country, which kind of made sense because we were neither with the Soviets nor with the Americans. Of course, we bought arms and ammunition from the Soviets, but we considered ourselves non-aligned. We weren't with anyone. And so very few countries are non-aligned. And I think just Yugoslavia, India, and Egypt, the three nations that said we are non-aligned. So that worked for us till about 70 odd years. But there had to come a time when we decided that perhaps non-alignment was not our story. And I will share examples of what I mean by this. I think India has started focusing on strategic alignment. It's very different from saying we are aligned. It's strategic alignment for our own interests. Very clearly, there are alignments, but focused on India's interest. The second big policy change that I'm beginning to see is offensive defense seems to be the new narrative versus defensive offense. It's not a play of words, but it's a way of thinking. I think the new way of thinking is we will be offensive in our thinking. And I'm going to give you so many examples of what I meant. And there are examples after examples on this whole format of offensive defense. The earlier way of thinking was defensive offense, which basically means if you hit me, I will not hit back. I will act as if I'm going to hit back, but will not hit back. So it was, and in the new way of thinking, the way of retaliating is that if you're going to hit me, I will hit you first. So there are these shifts taking place. And the third and perhaps the most important one, it would seem as if the safety, security, and the interests of the country will come first and politics will come later. It's early days yet, but there are certain signs that making India secure and a safer nation is becoming more important than its politics. So these are the three big policy changes starting to take place. And I want to spend time on each one of them because if we realize that we are starting to align, starting to take offensive defense measures, and for us, India first is the real story, then I think we kind of start looking at this country with a 25 to 30-year horizon where it will have a massive economic upside on our country as well. So let's just start with the first one. Let's talk about strategic alignment versus non-alignment. Let's look at strategic alignment. And are we seeing strategic alignments or not? So let me just give you some examples. Number one is Quad. Everyone has heard of what is happening with the Quad. It's the coming together of four nations: Japan, United States, Australia, and India. And it's not just, I mean, it is a format for trade, security, economics, waterways, protection of the seas, etc. But it is also the coming together of four nations in the Indo-Pacific region. And please remember that the Quad is nothing new. It is not something that was decided by this current government. In fact, it was conceived by the previous governments. It was never implemented by them. So the Quad went in for implementation only now. In fact, it's still under final in terms of what the look and feel will be, but the security arrangements around Quad are now being finalized. And there are many things that are happening under Quad, but the number one agenda of Quad is protection under Indo-Pacific. It's never happened before. And these are signs of alignments that I want to talk about, but this is not the only one. Let me show you so many other things that are happening on strategic alignment. Malabar exercises, these are like the largest military naval war games that have ever played out, and the Quad countries have already executed that sometime in 2020. India has signed 3 agreements with the US just before the Trump administration was leaving office. In fact, barely 30 days before Trump left office and Biden was to come in. The Democrats and the Republicans don't see eye to eye on virtually anything except one thing, that is India. So whether it was the Trump administration or now the Biden administration, there is one common agreement that they need to have some form of alignment with India. And there are 3 agreements we signed: LEMUA, COMCASA, BECA. Again, I'm not going to get into details of them, but India is amongst the very few nations which does not have a security agreement with Americans and yet got access to some of these security arrangements. Let me show you what I meant. Each one of them detail out what we get as a nation, but I want to just focus your attention on something like Becca. Becca gets India American satellite imagery intelligence, and it kind of helps us put together, and it's a network of satellites. And India now gets real-time satellite imagery with the help of American geospatial satellites. To put this together, India would have had to take another 25 years. But by signing these agreements, which were never done in the past, actually India is starting to kind of take advantage of security arrangements, but yet not saying that we are part of the American diaspora. So I'll tell you why that is important. And on the other side, India has gone and signed S-400s from the Russians. So America actually would never allow Indians to buy S-400 technology, but they didn't sanction us. They sanctioned Turkey for buying S-400. So I'm just giving you an overall picture that we are signing agreements like the Quad. We're taking intelligence help from the Americans. We're buying S-400 missiles. We're taking Israeli drones from, let's say, for a lot of surveillance. I mean, these are extremely high-tech machinery. We're also doing bilateral ties with Iran, which is at loggerheads with Americans. On top of it, the highest civilian awards are going to the Prime Minister of India right now from the Middle East. I mean, you can see there's a list of civilian awards that the Prime Minister has got in the recent times. On top of it, there was vaccine diplomacy. So where we were giving vaccines. In fact, that program started all over again. The piece that I want you to register in all of this, and the point that I'm trying to make out here, is that the time for non-alignment has gone. It doesn't mean that we take sides. I think the policymakers and the political diaspora has decided to have strategic alignments which are in the nation's interest, which is why even if we are with the Americans, we're not anti-Russia. Even if we are kind of working with Iran, we're not antagonizing the Americans. And in all of this process, one of the biggest shifts that has taken place is India's foreign relationships with each of the nations around us, of course, barring three. So it's it is quite an important shift in the way India has been thinking. It can have deep ramifications 25, 30 years out. But I think the big shifts are starting to show up. And I think along with alignments, you've got to also see what we are not doing. And I'm giving you some examples. In this whole strategic alignment, what are we not doing? So India assumed the presidency of the United Nations Security Council. It just happened a year ago. In the FATF, which is like the Anti-Terror Financing Act, Pakistan continues to remain on the gray list. Now look at what we didn't do. In strategic alignments, we did not sign the RCEP for providing support domestically. The RCEP was China's trade agreement in Asia. Every other country signed it. India did not. India did not join the BRI, which is known to everyone. And today, the European Union and India are kind of all, it will take another 5 years, but the first steps of a free trade agreement are already being constructed. I mean, that's where we are right now. And for the first time, the External Affairs Ministry now has 2 cabinet ministers. So again, I just want you all to recognize the fact that while you're aligning, you're not kind of forgetting friends, but you're also taking steps of not signing agreements that are not in India's interest. So this is the new way of looking at things, that in our own interest, for our own security concerns, and for kind of making sure that India stands tall, we're working with the Israelis, with the Americans, with the Russians, with the Middle East countries, and yet we are not disturbing, or let's say we're not destroying links with anyone. It's a big shift. The second shift I want to talk about is defensive offense versus offensive defense. We are in the era of offensive defense, which basically means if you're going to hit me, I will hit you back. But if I get to know you're going to hit me, I will try and hit you first. It's a huge shift. I can't explain how big this shift is, because you can only imagine. during 26/11, we were in Bombay, and the reaction on those 3 days and India's reaction as a nation after those events clearly showed that we were defensive in our outlook. At the time of the Parliament attack, where the entire political diaspora could have probably been wiped out, India's response was brass tacks, which basically meant we moved the army units right to the front, but after that pulled them back in a year. It is all a form of defensive offense. But in the last 7 or 8 years, there is this new format of looking at things from an offensive defense lens. If you're going to hit me, I'm going to hit you first. It has happened every year from 2014 onwards. Again, I just want to make this very, very clear. This is not a commentary on the political aspect of this nation, but the policy decision making of this nation. Offensive defense, let's just see what's happened. And every year it has happened. In 15, troops got ambushed, Indian army troops got ambushed, and we then sent special forces all the way into Myanmar to attack rebel forces. This is one of those rarest photos where the special forces team got captured, their photograph got captured, and they came back with a very successful operation. This was right at 2015. 2016 was Uri. Everyone knows about Uri surgical strikes. 2017 was standoff in Doklam. 2019 was Balakot. 2020 was Galwan. And actually, in a series of events that, I mean, if you just go back again, if you look at it 15, 16, 17, 19, and as we speak, we took on Galwan. Every year something has been happening, but these have not been responses. In many formats, they've actually been preemptive measures as well. And it's a big shift, which basically means that you are willing to take the narrative and kind of push the envelope beyond a point. It's very critical for a nation to display its strength at the cost of pushing the envelope a bit too far. And I say that with great responsibility, because if these events were not to take place, we will forever ever be in a position of getting knocked around. So if you're a serious power to begin with, it's not just about GDP and it's not just about your market capitalization. It's also about your ability to say up bus, no more. And I think year after year, we've had that happening. And there are many things happening on this front. The first indigenous aircraft carriers, in fact, this has now gone live. Vikrant has gone live. We're the only country in this part of the world which has 2 aircraft carriers. BrahMos, and this particular missile format is now going to be exported. This is next level missile technology. Vietnam's probably going to buy this from us. The Rafales have come in, and submarines, etc., including nuclear propelled submarines. But I think the biggest offensive defense happened in the way India tackled COVID. And these are slightly dated numbers now, but you can see that in Delhi, we are 100% vaccinated. Bombay's I was listening to someone, and they're 100% vaccinated. This country has vaccinated at a level that was unprecedented in less than 6 months or in less than 8 months, which is perhaps why we can tackle Omicron. So the reason why I put this slide up was that we did come under a bioweapons attack. Under normal circumstances, we could have been probably swept away by it. It hit us very hard, but in less than 6 months, we become one of those few countries that has protected its population. And you've seen images where people who are nurses and healthcare workers are going through forests and bridges and on from hills just to give that injection. And this is a story that will probably be remembered for decades as to how India went in for its vaccination program, and then of course oxygen, etc., etc. And I think in the format of looking how we are tackling things, this becomes another story of how we tackled COVID, or how we are tackling COVID in an offensive manner and not necessarily taking it. We're only amongst the 5 countries in the world who have created a vaccine for it. And of course, there's so much happening. And finally, on this aspect of offensive defense, I just want to reiterate, remember that and I'm sure all of you have read this many times, that in the offensive format, we handle 2.5 fronts. There is China, there is Pakistan, and then there's always this internal insurgency, whether it's Kashmir, and probably now bits of it starting to emerge. Too early to say, but let's say Kashmir, the insurgency of this. So we always tackle 2.5 fronts. This is nothing new, but we're beginning to tackle it even more so now. There is a power projection in the region, and India is actually not backing down from taking tough decisions. Now, I think what this does is that it puts you at a format in which it can be time consuming, it can take resources, it will require us as a nation to take some really tough decisions, but you then start to grow into a formidable power, certainly in the region. And that's the second shift, policy shift I'm beginning to see, which is offensive defense. The first one being alignments, second one is offensive defense. And the third one that I want to talk to all of you about is India first versus politics first. This is work in progress. I mean, as a nation, at a national level, clearly there is too much of political fractionalism. There's just so much happening and it leaves you in a bit of a disarray to figure out that why can't we just get the whole piece of country first and then politics. I think there is, for the first time, a bit of India first starting to emerge. Of course, there's a hell of a lot of politicking, no doubt about it. But I want to share with you what's happening on some of this issue of how the nation's starting to become more important than the politics itself. Let's just come to some. In the last 6 years, the country has constructed 65 strategic roads. None of these were started in the last 6 years. They've been in progress for the last 15 years. The only difference is closure in the last 6 years. And there are the importance of strategic roads is that at times of conflict, it's the road that will get you to protect your vast areas of territory. 65 strategic roads, tremendous amount of what the Border Roads Organization has done it's sometimes it's incredible. They worked at minus 25 degrees to kind of create highways that will allow passage through the toughest terrain. And I mean, again, this is something that we are seeing. I've heard of friends, relatives. In fact, some of them have traveled on these roads to see that between Delhi, Meerut or Dehradun, Delhi, Jaipur, Chandigarh, the way this country is transforming on highways is quite spectacular. And I think if you give it another, I mean, if you look at what this space could do over the next 5 and 6 years, it can be a dramatic shift. And you all are parts of serious businesses, and you've got, you understand what logistics means, what logistics cost would mean. And if India becomes, if this is the generation of highways over the next 5 and 7 years, you can imagine what this could do to the country's growth and its GDP. The third thing is something that we talk about daily. I mean, it's quite visible that in the startup world, India is right up there amongst the top 3, maybe in the top 4 in the world right now, as far as unicorns are concerned. This is not just about unicorns. Everything that the fact that we are sitting here and all of us are talking to each other, the fact that India's adoption on digital is amongst the very best in the world speaks a lot. And just so many aspects of our world we now touch digitally, and businesses are being built around it, suggests that there was infrastructure that got the right infrastructure got created for a Paytm, or for that matter, a Dream 11 or a Policy Bazaar or an Ola to ride that and kind of create this entire ecosystem for us Indians to look at next level businesses. Again, take a 10-year view out, and you'll see that this seems to be a great story for us as citizens. And sometimes we forget what toilets can do to our nation. And I was reading this report that toilet building has reduced deaths because, for that matter, child deaths. Children would die because of malaria, children would die because of open defecation. And all of that those numbers are quite staggering, because a toilet built inside a village means that the woman of that village does not have to go to the forest in the morning or at night. When she would do that, she would actually fall sometimes and break her legs or break her hand, because at night you can't navigate through the forest. You and me cannot relate to all of these because we don't live in the village to imagine the impact of what a toilet can do in our lives. But there is this change that is happening in India, where even building toilets is starting to result in economic indicators improving. Same thing on Jandhan, Aadhaar, mobile, and if you look at what's happened on Aadhaar and Jandhan, there's just the entire ability for India to now transact, etc. It's quite well documented. I don't need to get into the details. And in a nutshell, what I just wanted to kind of share with you, it seems from a policymaker's perspective, India's economic and national security matters now more than winning elections. Very early days, it's just, it's very easy for someone to kind of make that comment, but if it is not backed up, I wouldn't say it'll still take us probably 2 decades to really be at a stage where we can easily say that national interests are now paramount, but we're certainly on the right track on this one. And definitely serious efforts have been made to improve the lives of citizens. So, and you can see that this is happening in states as well. It's not as if this is all central level effort. No, definitely not. There is some work that the center does, but there's a lot of work that the states end up doing. And that is why there is this improvement in citizens' lives. And I think a bit of that is now getting reflected in the standing that India started to enjoy. In fact, some of the parameters where the numbers are starting to improve. So it's just the culmination of some of these factors where I think India first, like I said, is still going to take a bit of time, but the first steps seem to be in the right direction. Just so kind of what I wanted to share with you is alignments, offensive defense, and India first. But what does all this mean from our immediate neighbors' perspective? Because all of this is the way we are reflecting towards the 9 formats of war. Now, unfortunately, out of those 9 formats of war, probably the biggest proponent of it all is China, which happens to be sitting right on our heads. It is a neighbor. Now, no other nation in the world has to deal with China as much as we do, apart from the Taiwanese, because they sit square on our heads. And it's kind of it's just a overbearing neighbor that we have to deal with. Think of it as someone who you don't like, who kind of shares the wall with you. So you've got to deal with it. And I want to tell you something, that in the whole narrative building, in the entire narrative of how China's projected, what I'm going to show you over the next 5 or 7 slides is the reality of that actual story that's playing behind the scenes, which you and me aren't really supposed to know, that's the way to look at it is, even though we know it, we ignore it. So if you are a global citizen, and even if you are a Chinese, even if you are whatever, you are an Indian, Chinese, or whatever, you're an American, I want to show you some aspects of China which you do see, but you don't register. So as a citizen, this is what you're seeing about China. This is a photograph that came out when the Talibanis went to China to sign the latest agreement. And this is barely 7 months old. If you're a global citizen, you're actually seeing the foreign minister of China stand with probably designated terrorists in the world. And not a word is said about it. In fact, it's splashed in the papers. So Taliban is China's new friend. You got this photograph. And now you remember you're a global citizen. You're an Indian, you're a Chinese. And this is what you see. No problem, acceptable, fine. What you're seeing more is that this is a Chinese virus. You have an institute of virology kind of where so much research going on. And the world is beginning to question the Chinese, that what have you done to us? And in fact, so many reports now saying that this perhaps is a man-made weapon, probably not released by mistake escape. Whichever way you look at it, it is a weapon. So there's the Chinese virus. There are debt traps. Every day there are articles where countries after countries are now struggling to repay the debt, and their land is being acquired by the Chinese, whether it's part of Africa, whether it's Sri Lanka. So the Belt and Road Initiative is now turning out to be actually a way of acquiring without shooting. And that's exactly what is happening in many parts of the world. The Chinese debt trap, it's phenomenal. You all have probably heard of Evergrande now, but it's quite incredible what's happening with China's real estate. It is single largest structural damage that will happen in China. Its real estate is on the verge of a structural collapse because every aspect of real estate is governed by, even costs and sales are governed by the local governments, because 84% of tax revenues come from real estate and 40% of China's GDP is real estate. They cannot allow households to sell at a lower price than what they bought. So it's completely artificial. I've done tremendous research on this and I'm happy to share it in a separate forum. But you should be very worried about China's real estate. It could probably have some impact in other parts of the world, but no one talks about it. It is a phenomenal story on how it's been protected. Hackers get into India's power grid. And then, of course, there was this whole thing when Trump actually banned Huawei and ZTE because the Chinese had copyright issues. They were infringing and they were kind of literally getting into systems of Amazon, Apple, etc., etc. And that's how Huawei got banned. And the whole story of how US now wants to starve China of its chips. And the EU, this is something that is unheard of. The EU is the largest trading partner with China. They have gone and suspended trade deals with China. And guess what? Who is the largest beneficiary of Omicron right now? The Europeans. I'm not kind of making a straight line comparison that EU has suspended trade deal and hence there's Omicron, but it's for you to see. And for the first time, the Germans have pushed back against the Chinese. It has never happened in over 20 years. So there is something happening where the world is starting to come together and start to question it, but it's still not registering in our minds that kuch to gadbad hai. And finally, stock exchanges out there have got hammered. Tech companies have got hammered. Businessmen are now seriously scared to come out and speak. And there is slowdown happening. And the thing that we tend to overlook most of the times is that there is something known as the high heel line, or what you can see out here on the left hand side. 94% of China lives on the right hand side of the white line, and only 6% live on the left hand side. And the 6% is actually all of occupied lands, which is Tibet and Xinjiang areas. So primarily, China is a country which is occupying lands and it's still making life miserable for the 6% who live there. And you can see Tibet and Xinjiang, basically all fairly occupied nations. The point I'm just trying to make in the last section of this talk is fault lines exist in the neighborhood. Just don't fall for what is being fed to us and don't fall for the narratives, because I think there is an existential crisis in China. Of course, they're powerful. They've got fancy technology. They've got everything going for them. But there is a serious issue out there that they're contending and are dealing with, starting with conductors, 5G, and now Taliban. It's not easy. It's not as fanciful as it seems. Actually, the contrary is also true, that perhaps India is starting to get its act right and is ready to take on its fault lines in the neighborhood. I can just want to summarize by saying that there are these new frontiers of war. India's tectonic shifts starting to take place to take on the new world. And I think the world is coming together to tackle this for the next 20 years. So that's what I wanted to share with all of you and kind of put this all together and let you all know that I think there are these shifts happening. And they're, again, 7 years, 8 years is too early in like kind of demonstrating that. But the first steps, and if you now extrapolate it and take a 30-year view, you can imagine where this nation could go. And it could very well result in some serious wealth building also, because this could have some dramatic economic impact in the growth of a nation. I'll leave it here and open to.
This was as interesting as expected, Karan. Thank you so much for this. And it also gives a sense of pride. I must say, the fact that India has progressed so much from what we used to hear maybe a decade ago to where we stand right now in doing certain things on policy, at least, which seems to be working. Anyway, let me get to some of the questions that I see. Okay, so is too much democracy and federal structure in India slowly becoming a liability? Policy and processes both are slow in terms of implementations. If you compare us with China, even with US and Russia, it seems that our constitutional and demographic structure is different. Do you think all of this puts India as an easy target in the overall scheme of things?
Yeah, I'll answer this question very quickly and in a very short manner. We are Indians. Do we want to live here or in a setup like the Chinese, where every word I say has to be measured, careful, cannot question anyone, and I can only be a yes man? Sitting here, I can do whatever I wish to. I can question any political party. I can raise my voice, say what I want to, but I may not necessarily see the kind of progress a nation like China has had because they can bulldoze their way through. Any day I would take the democratic format because it allows me expression of my point of view. And remember, no system has been faultless. So the Chinese have done some dramatically great work up until 2016 or 2017. As far as economically, they've lifted their nation out of poverty. But beyond a point when their ambitions have become so large that they've had to take on the world, it doesn't mean that democracies have struggled. It just means autocracies are no longer the story. I don't want to get dramatic out here, but there are many, many similarities with Nazi Germany. And this is not about World War II. I mean, I'm just saying the way thought processes worked at that time, that Germans are the very best in the world. They can take on the world. If you don't follow my way of thinking, I will bulldoze you, etc., etc. So I would any day go with the democratic way of thinking. It allows me my space. It allows, as a nation, I mean, I'm just saying that, yes, it has its own faults, but where in the world will you get to say what you want to and not be penalized for it?
Agreed. In your opinion, why didn't India follow this offensive defense at our eastern border with China? I mean, what holds back our rulers from taking an aggressive posture with China, just the same way we do it with, let's say, Pakistan?
Many things went wrong in the past, many things. And I think there's no point kind of delving into the past as to see what went wrong. And I guess we were in awe of China. In 62, at the time of the 62 war, you'd be surprised that the Indian Air Force was asked to stand down, not to participate in the 62 war. In fact, it was a much more superior Air Force to the Chinese, but we were asked to stand down. It just doesn't make sense. And we were pushed into that war with very basic infrastructure. So what has happened in the past now hopefully has no bearing. But the good news is that now we're adopting those measures so that issues like that don't happen again. And it's incredible that a nation, I mean, we are not a rich nation, and yet it is the onus of this nation to take on the Chinese, because that entire juggernaut comes and stands still on the Chinese borders. So this is a responsibility that we have to the world and got to execute it.
Right. Some interesting questions split into two parts. So maybe I'll ask the first part first, and then we'll come to the later. Could you share your views on the possibility of future wars apart from the ones that you listed? And perhaps one of them is alarmingly from space. Could that be a possibility there?
Sorry, can you just repeat that, Nitin? I kind of lost your...
Yeah. Is there what is your view on the possibility of any future wars apart from the ones that you already mentioned? And could there be any war coming from space?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I didn't speak about it because it's just something that I'm not well equipped to handle. I haven't studied much about it. I must make this amply clear. Please don't think that this is out in the future. The 9 formats are already up and running. We're already in the middle of wars. So please don't be in any illusion that this will happen at some stage. We are in the middle of all of them. water wars, cyber trade wars, economic wars, all of them are happening simultaneously. And the question to ask is, will we get into a conventional war at some point in time? My reading is that perhaps the answer is yes. There is a possibility of a conventional war. It may not start in our neighborhood. It may start someplace in the South China Sea, because remember, the most volatile place right now is actually South China Sea and Taiwan. That's where the real story is. And I think there again, the coming together of the Quad is like a coming together of 4 nations to stop any form of aggression in South China Sea. Is there a possibility of a conventional war? It seems so, could be.
Understood. You spoke a lot about China's real estate and the fact that they're going through a lot. If you were to just put an estimate of what kind of scale of damage could this lead to for the Chinese economy, as well as to the world economy and financial markets globally?
Massive. I mean, Evergrande is just the tip of the entire iceberg. And I must share this with all of you that it is like in Bombay, if BMC's revenue 85% of BMC's revenue cannot come from real estate. If it did, then BMC, or for that matter, the corporation in either Bombay or Delhi, cannot allow real estate to fall. So Nitin, I'm going to give you an example and you'll be shocked to hear this. A husband-wife, basically, couple, on an average, how many houses do you think they own in China? I mean, a typical husband-wife couple. It is staggering. It is 6 to 7 houses they own, not 1 or 2. And each of them are levered up, each of them. Now, extrapolate that to the middle class in China, and you'll notice that the kind of debt that they've taken on, because the belief is that real estate can never fall. And it is true, because if it falls, then the revenues for the government come down. Because if 85% of your revenue is linked to real estate and 40% of your GDP is linked to real estate, you cannot allow real estate prices to fall. Hence, it is artificially kept up. And the minute you allow mark to market to come into real estate, it is a structural downtrend. So I would think that one of the biggest issues that the Chinese will face, in fact, it's not just the Chinese economy. In fact, the common man out there, the husband, wife, the person who's kind of literally putting all his savings or her savings into real estate, they will, for decades, end up becoming, they'll probably be debtors to bankers for life. It's very serious.
Okay. Has democratic development become an oxymoron, as most progress has only been made after solid control by the current dispensation? Your thoughts?
Not true, yeah. I mean, you look at, okay, let me explain. This question is, okay, this is a classic question on narrative and how we are thinking. It is amazing what we want. What this question suggests is that should we discard democracy and become autocratic? So Nitin, think about this very hard. Finally, they have got us to think that our way of building our nation is incorrect. And hence the new ideology is let's adopt the Chinese way. Isn't that a success? That's exactly the point I was trying to make, that is in this whole narrative, it is no longer about conquering borders. It is about conquering ideology. And if this question has come up, it just shows that we're headed in that direction where we're questioning what has been built and saying perhaps that other ideology, that is what it is all about. And I would say that just be careful of the way we think about all this, because imagine that the richest man in China cannot be visible for the last 6 months simply because he questioned the banks in a certain format. Imagine if, I mean, again, this is absolutely, don't get me wrong out here, the richest Indian having to really think 10 times over that he could really be, censured or kind of be put behind bars, or 85 businessmen died in China over the last 7 years. They've just disappeared. So it's the ideology wars out here.
True, true. Okay, another good question. The Art of War, it's a book, teaches us to rely not on the likelihood of the enemies not coming, but on our own readiness to receive them. Do you think India is ready? I mean, you put in a lot of examples to show that somewhere there is definite enough progress. But by not firing any bullets, do we have our own way of tackling some of these issues?
Yeah, there are ways. See, remember that the first shifts are to actually demonstrate your readiness and willingness to take this head on. And I think those are first signs that it doesn't mean that we've got it all taped up. No, not at all. That's not what I said at all. In fact, what I said is these are the first steps. It could take 2 decades till we really stand, as a very serious power in the region. And 2 decades in the life of a nation is nothing. It depends on, but we spent 70 years, right, in the earlier format. But do you want to do that for the next 70 years? The answer is perhaps no. Because the next 70 years could be very, very different from the last 70 years. So I think India's first steps, India's readiness to adopt to this new line of thinking is starting to emerge. And it is putting a lot of people at unease. The 370 is a classic example. 370 is a classic example. The Home Minister then standing in the parliament and saying, "Ke Aksai Chin hamara hai." You don't stand in the parliament and make that announcement. It's not a press conference. It's the temple of democracy in this nation. It is serious stuff. And then saying that POK is hamara hai. Now, are we kind of moving tanks into those areas? No, not today.
Okay, there are so many questions. I mean, we could go on all night, but I'm just trying to look at some of the ones which are kind of okay. What is the most immediate and sensitive geopolitical issue other than the virus which can occur and which can potentially make us more aggressively responsive?
Taiwan. And the reason is not because Taiwan is a country that the Chinese love. They have no love. In fact, it's barely, it's just an island. But remember, there's a question right now that I just saw on TSMC. TSMC is the semiconductor producer to the world. Nothing moves without semiconductors. And Taiwan is the center of semiconductor manufacturing in the world. It just doesn't make semiconductors. It makes 5nm semiconductors, which is like the most advanced semiconductors, which allow you drone warfare, space warfare. If you don't get that access of semiconductors and microchips, which the US has banned China now, then China will lose the future war of algorithms, drone warfare, and space warfare. So the entire focus is on getting Taiwan for its semiconductors, not for its land. And I think if the Chinese are pushed, they will, and if they don't get access to microchips, they will not allow the world to get it. It is the classic scorched earth policy. अगर तुम मेरे को नहीं लेने दोगे, तो मैं तुमको भी नहीं लेने दूंगा. So the biggest, most strategic, and probably the most damaging area right now, and at least something which can be, it is something that the world has to be very, very careful about.
Right. Maybe move a little bit away from India. Any light on what you are seeing on the Russia-Ukrainian border? Any thoughts out there?
Yeah, it's actually. I just want to talk about the Russia story from another angle also. Remember that if the Russia, there is this classic thinking that the Chinese and the Russians are colluding, right? And they're coming together. But actually, you will be surprised to know that the Chinese have said that there are parts of Russia that belong to China. And Tashkent is one of them. So again, it's something that doesn't come out very much in the open, but the Chinese have laid claim on Russian land, which is quite incredible, right? So everything is not very, very seamless on the China-Russia equation. On Ukraine, I think the issue is more about how NATO is coming together in putting its advanced weaponry against the Russians. It's more about that, less about Ukraine. And Ukraine was kind of allowing NATO to have its presence there, which is what the Russians are pushing back on. I don't think it's much of, it's not about it being a flashpoint as much as it is about messaging, where the Russians are pushing back saying that this is not about getting more NATO access towards Russia. So I think it's a fair assessment that there is this animosity, but it's not a flashpoint.
Understood. What other demographic changes are you observing around the world or are expected to have, which will have a probably positive impact on the global dynamics?
Okay, there are a couple of very positive developments that are beginning to happen. And the number one in that kind of is the way the world is now beginning to identify second lines of supply chains. It's massive. Again, please take 20-year views. We are in 2022, but the world supply chain routes, manufacturers, countries that really kind of become the manufacturers to the world, 20 years from now will be very different from what they are today. To my mind, that's the biggest shift happening in the world. And you can already see that a nation like Vietnam is the biggest beneficiary of that change. They've done some remarkable stuff in the last 7 years. They've literally turned things around. They've kind of becoming the mini manufacturer to the world. And this is just the start of it all. So I won't call it a demographic shift because demography is not at play out here, but the world is now looking for supply chains and a new manufacturing structure. And I think in 10 years, 15 years, that would be the biggest, perhaps contributing to growth to many, many countries. And in that, India will be a participant, but not a massive participant, because we're still not cracked manufacturing to the extent that we could have. And hence the dependence on services will always be much higher than on manufacturing. It'll be silly on our part to believe that we can be replacing China's manufacturing might. And I don't make no illusion on that one. We will be part beneficiaries, but the world will see brand new structures come up.
Understood. Okay, another interesting geographical location. Why isn't anyone talking about Africa, which is one of the biggest land masses between all the powerhouses, US, European Union, and China?
In fact, this is where the Chinese did some remarkable work, and all credit to them for having got into Africa at least a decade ahead of everyone else, and which is where the BRI came into picture. They created in Djibouti, which is in Yemen, they created a naval base for themselves. And but again, the world's just gotten up and realized what's happening literally after Trump came into existence. Prior to that, no, we weren't even talking about all this. So it's as early as 4 years now. But there's a lot of work that the Indian, in fact, I have a slide on this. I don't have it here today. There's a particular slide that I have on how India is making its arrangements with Madagascar, with Mauritius, and the Comoros, and all of this is happening in and around the African nations. In fact, we don't have it's not as if we have lost the plot there. In probably 10 years behind schedule, but definitely not lost the plot. This is where the Chinese have a massive head start, because they've actually gone and had access to materials, and they've built the right infrastructure. So this is an area where there's a bit of a 10-year lag, no doubt about it.
Okay. This is maybe a little crystal ball gazing, but I do observe a few questions on currency wars, right?
Yeah.
And the dollar is a global reserve currency, and it's a key peg for commodities as well. do you see any kind of outlook that you see there? And if I cast my mind back to 2015, is the last time I remember a devaluation taking place from the Chinese yuan as well. Any views on that as well?
So, Nitin, the way you have to look at this question is that 15 to 22, that's 7 years, has the dollar got replaced? No, it's in fact gotten stronger. Has the yuan made a dent? Actually, the answer is no. It's really not made any dent in the way they thought it or envisaged it. So what is the way that they're trying to deal with it? It is about then currency in a different format, which is where the Chinese are now going to allow cryptocurrency at their own level so as to probably play out the currency wars. But I think that the yuan will become like a second player to the US dollar, in fact, even overtake it. That's not really happened. And the dollar continues to be the dominant player. I have another view around it, but that for some other time.
Sure. You know, we could, like I said, we could go on, but maybe let's take a final question for today's session. All that you spoke about, and you reiterated that it's not so much on the political establishment, but more on the policy that is happening from an Indian standpoint right now. In your mind, if even if the establishment changes, if a new government comes to power at some stage going forward, are some of these things likely to take a change, or is this more permanent in outlook?
I think that is a really good question. This is a bit of a I would believe that parts of this are irreversible now. Parts of this are irreversible because the belief that this is now in India's interest will now be understood by various political parties. Now, will they kind of adopt it entirely? Will they kind of keep parts, not throw away parts? No, there will be parts that probably will be dismantled, but I think the direction cannot be now changed. It's the same thing that I'll give you an example of something that is kind of on similar lines. Trump took on Chinese and was belligerent about it. The Biden administration has not taken on the Chinese, and yet they are doing things which cannot be undone. As in, like, what Trump has started, Biden cannot undo, even though they're not in the face. You get the point I'm making, Nitin, because they're on completely dramatically poles apart politicians. Absolutely. Right? But this path cannot be undone now.
Understood.
And I think this is where democracy and our ability to then think through comes to. One last piece I want to leave everyone behind with is, I don't think we give enough credit to the Indian voter. And we tend to believe that they vote on religious lines or caste lines. There is tremendous amount of research by the best brains that have come and shown that chief ministers are being chosen on their ability to deliver on development. I may not relate to that chief minister because I can't understand that chief minister. Has nothing to do with their ability to deliver on development. For example, Delhi. I may not be an AAP fan, just as an example, but can I see some bits happening on school and education and perhaps on medical, etc.? Of course. So will Delhi now vote back AAP? They did. Right? I may not, as an individual, I may not relate to, let's say, the BJP in some parts of the country, but have they kind of done some amazing work on highways and kind of building toilets in Uttar Pradesh? Are they bringing up the quality of life out there? Of course they are. Is there a chance that Yogi could come back on the ideology of development? Yes, of course. So there is this big shift. So India is choosing her chief ministers well and the prime minister as well. We don't give enough credit to the Indian voter.
Right. So on that note, as I mentioned, I was really looking forward to it, and you more than delivered. Thank you so much, Karan. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
And I've seen a lot of remarks from our participants as well, complimenting on an extremely well-made presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
And
Nitin. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you to all our participants as well for all those questions and for participating in. Please do join us for future webinars as well. On that note, thank you so much, everyone, and stay safe. Yeah, thank you so much, Karan. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.